Okay, early A body folks. So here is the backside of a 64 Valiant Barracuda instrument cluster, and I guess there's been some confusion on the isolation of the input voltage for the voltage regulator. So this I, that means input. So 12 volts DC comes in on this pin, comes down this solder trace, right? And when you take your captive nut, when that screws around the post and makes contact with the copper, then the copper conducts through the nut to the post, okay? That gives you your 12 volts. And then inside the regulator is there's a converter, a limiter in there that limits the voltage to 5 volts pulsating DC, which is this stud travels along this solder run to temperature. And you can see there's an A there, and there's an A here. And then the S means sender, right? This is the fuel gauge sender on that pin. Here is the temperature gauge sender on this pin. And that one goes to there. So when the 12 volts comes in here, right, comes down here to this solder pad, this solder trace right here, we want to isolate, there, that's a pretty good view. We want to isolate it from the stud. So you have to pull your gauge out, take the whole cluster apart, take your gauge apart. This red stuff right here, this was heat shrink. I've done the demo a few times, so things are starting to look kind of ratty, but you can almost tell though that we're kind of isolated from the stud to the copper trace. I think I said solder trace earlier, that was incorrect. This is a copper trace. So you can kind of see here that nothing's touching. That's one step, right? That's the first step. Then, this is the wrong lug, okay, but you need to kind of get the idea. So this is the limiter that I built on the last couple of videos. This is like a 5-second build. I don't have the right lug, but this will work. So the red, right, that's for power. The lug now, see how it doesn't touch the stud? So that's important, okay. Now if you had it a little bit closer, you can kind of see that it's not touching anything as I move it around when it's flush, right? So you have that part of it. And, well, I had, oh, there it is. Bear with me here. And the next thing you want to do is you want to get a plastic washer. And that plastic washer is going to go over the stud so that now, when you tighten this thing back down, and you tighten it tightly, right? This nut, right, will go over the stud and it will make contact with the plastic washer, but not the lug, so that only 12 volts goes to the wire, not the stud. So once again, look at a stack up of this. It would go the nut, plastic washer, and then the lug. So when the lug now is making contact on this the copper trace here, right? So when power is applied here, 12 volts, it will come down, make contact with the lug, Okay, go to the limiter, and then we're going to block it on the stud by using this little plastic washer. I hope that makes sense to everybody. I can't get it any more simpler than that. You know, you could use electrical tape to do this isolation here with the, oh, now it's down in that little hole. It went down there. But anyway, you can use electrical tape. Heat shrink seems to work best for this application. You could take your water and solder it to this copper trace, get a little flux. Solder works real well. If you did that, you would then only need to use a copper washer and the nut. You could even use a plastic nut as well, and that would also suffice. You just need to make sure that there is no way that voltage can come from this copper trace to this stud. When you're done, right, you want to check your work. Let me get this out of here. There it goes. So you want to check your work. What you want to do is, once your trace is on there, once your lug is on there, washer's on there, everybody's happy, the nut's on, you put your 12 volts here on the input, right? And then you ground the case, and you're going to read for voltage right here. You should have no voltage. You should have 12 volts over here, right? And then once you ground this lug, and then you stick the 5-volt wire, right? That's going to go here on this guy, because when you make the contact here at the solder trace under the nut, obviously, then this is going to power 5 volts for the temperature gauge and the fuel gauge. This is all one circuit, right? And then this will go to your fuel sender, and that's how you're going to get deflection. Now, if you don't have a fuel gauge, you can ground this. Take your sender, ground it. You should see positive deflection, nice smooth needle movement. And you can also put a light here, a test light here, and that should be solid. If it flashes at you, you've not isolated this stud, right? Because we said that this here was pulsating 5 volts DC. So I hope that makes sense to everybody. Once again, you've got to isolate your stud, from the solder trace here. You don't want it to touch it all, right? You can kind of see there. And then you want to isolate the nut from the lug. So you'll do that. And then you'll take your nut, put your nut on. Obviously I'm doing this one-handed, so you just want to make sure that in the end, you can kind of see the stack here from the side, right? You got your copper trace, the lug, the plastic washer, and then the nut. So the nut and the stud, right, they're electrically the same, but there's no power here because there's no way for the power to get from the trace to the nut. All right, that's it for now.